I was bleeding out on a cold emergency room table when the trauma surgeon finally reached my mother on speakerphone. Through the blinding pain and the screaming of medical monitors, I heard the one person who was supposed to protect me let out a heavy, annoyed sigh. "We cannot leave right now," she told the doctor. "My son has a golf tournament, and his fiancé's parents just flew in from Greenwich. We will come tomorrow if she is still there." That was the exact sentence I heard before the monitors flatlined and my world went completely black. I am Chloe, 33 years old, and my family literally chose a country club appearance over my life. What they did not know was that the daughter they left to die was secretly funding their entire high society existence. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled their fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to save your own life. The pain tore through my abdomen like shredded glass. I had been working 80-hour weeks preparing for the national retail launch of my organic skincare line, ignoring the sharp cramps for days because I had to finalize a massive distribution deal. I had to secure that deal because my parents' mortgage payment was due, and they had come to rely on my silent, anonymous financial transfers to maintain their wealthy facade in Atlanta. I collapsed right in the middle of my office. My business partner and best friend Malik had found me unconscious on the floor and called the ambulance. Now, I was lying under the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room. A ruptured ectopic pregnancy, the doctors said. I was hemorrhaging internally. The medical staff moved around me in a frantic blur, cutting off my clothes and shouting medical terms I could barely process. Dr. Evans leaned over me, his face tight with professional panic. He asked for my emergency contact. I could barely breathe, but I managed to whisper my mother's cell phone number. I thought no matter how much my mother Brenda criticized me, no matter how much she favored my older brother Jamal, a mother would drop everything for her dying child. Dr. Evans dialed the number and put the phone on speaker, holding it near my ear so I could hear her voice. It rang 3 times before she picked up. The background noise on her end was full of clinking glasses and polite laughter. "This is Brenda Washington," she answered, using her practiced polite society tone. "Mrs. Washington, this is Dr. Evans at Atlanta General Hospital. I have your daughter, Chloe, here. She has suffered a severe internal hemorrhage from a ruptured ectopic pregnancy. We are rushing her into emergency surgery right now. Her condition is critical. You and your husband need to get here immediately." The silence on the other end of the line was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I waited for the gasp. I waited for the panic. I waited for my mother to ask if I was going to survive. Instead, I heard her cover the receiver and whisper something to my father, Calvin. When she returned to the call, her voice was dripping with absolute irritation. "Doctor, we are at the country club right now," she said. "Jamal is playing in the alumni golf tournament finals in 20 minutes. His fiancée, Brittany, is here, and her parents just flew down to meet us. They are a very prominent white family from Greenwich, and we are hosting them. We cannot just leave and cause a scene. Chloe has a habit of being overly dramatic about her health to get attention." Dr. Evans looked at me with sheer horror in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rising in disbelief, "I do not think you understand. Your daughter has lost a massive amount of blood. She is going into hypovolemic shock. She may not make it through the night." I felt the last ounce of my strength draining away, but my mind was sharply focused on the phone. "Look," Dr. Brenda sighed heavily, as if she were speaking to a nuisance telemarketer. "Tell her we are praying for her. We will come tomorrow if she is still there." The line clicked dead. She hung up. She hung up on a trauma surgeon telling her that her daughter was dying. She hung up because Jamal was playing golf and she needed to impress Brittany's wealthy parents. Jamal was 30 years old, a golden child who had never held a steady job, constantly launching failed startup companies that I ended up quietly funding just to keep my parents from begging me for money. Brittany was his aesthetic prize, A blonde woman who treated our family like an exotic accessory, completely unaware that the Washington family wealth was entirely manufactured by the dark-skinned sister they treated like a peasant. My vision began to tunnel. The last thing I saw was Dr. Evans shouting for a crash cart. The last sound I heard was the long, continuous tone of the heart monitor announcing that my heart had stopped. I flatlined. In that dark void between life and death, I realized the devastating truth. I had spent my entire life trying to buy the love of people who would not even step off a golf course to watch me take my last breath. I woke up 3 days later. The sterile smell of the intensive care unit burned my nostrils. There was a tube down my throat and machines whirring rhythmically beside my bed. My body felt like it was made of lead, but I was alive. I slowly opened my eyes. Sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair next to my bed was Malik. He looked exhausted. He was wearing the same suit he had on when I collapsed in the office. His tie was gone, and he had dark circles under his eyes. When he saw me blinking, he jumped up and pressed the nurse call button. Tears filled his eyes as he carefully took my hand. "You scared the life out of me, Chloe," he whispered. After the nurses removed the breathing tube and stabilized me, Malik poured me a small cup of water. The cold liquid soothed my raw throat. I looked around the quiet room. There were no flowers. There were no balloons. There were no parents. "Where are they?" I asked, my voice raspy and weak. Malik looked away, his jaw clenching with barely contained rage. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out my personal cell phone. He placed it on the tray table in front of me. "It has been 72 hours, Chloe," he said quietly. "I kept your phone charged, just in case." I unlocked the screen. There were dozens of emails from work. There were messages from my production team. But there were 0 missed calls from Brenda. There were 0 missed calls from Calvin. 72 hours had passed since a surgeon told them I might die, and they had not bothered to dial my number once. I opened my text messages. There was exactly one message from my family. It was from Jamal. It had been sent late last night. "Mom said you are playing the victim at the hospital again to ruin my weekend. Can you wire me $3,000 for the celebratory dinner tonight? Brittany wants lobster and her parents are expecting top-tier service from us. Do not ignore this, Chloe." I stared at the screen. I did not cry. I had shed all my tears on the operating table. The woman who desperately wanted a mother died that night in the emergency room. The woman who woke up in this hospital bed was someone entirely different. For years, I had endured their colorism and their financial abuse. I was the darker-skinned daughter who was told to stay out of the sun, told to focus on the books because I would never have Jamal's light-skinned privilege or charm. I built a massive organic skincare empire from nothing, creating products for women who looked like me. I became a self-made multimillionaire, but to my parents, I was just an ungrateful spinster who needed to financially support her brother's black excellence image. I paid their country club dues through a blind trust. I paid the mortgage on their Buckhead estate. I funded Jamal's life. And my reward was being left to die alone. I looked up at Malik. He was watching me closely, clearly expecting me to break down. Instead, I unplugged the phone from the charging cable and handed it to him. "Wipe it," I said. My voice was calm and steady. Malik frowned. "Wipe the phone." "Factory reset it," I commanded. "Then contact the wealth management firm. I want the platinum credit cards I gave Brenda and Calvin canceled immediately. Report them as lost or stolen, I do not care. Stop the auto drafts for the Buckhead estate. Cut off the seed money account for Jamal's startup company." Chloe Malik said, his eyes widening in shock. "If you cut off the money, they are going to lose everything. They will not be able to pay for the country club or the wedding." "That is exactly the point," I replied. They left me to die, Malik. They literally told the doctor they would come if I was still here. Well, I am not here anymore. The family bank is permanently closed. Malik, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face, nodded. He took the phone and tapped the screen, executing the factory reset. Consider it done. What else? Find me a private recovery facility, I said. A high-end medical suite where they cannot find me. When they finally decide to show up here to ask for their money, I want this room completely empty. We are disappearing. The gears were already turning in my head. Cutting them off was just the beginning. They cared about their image and their high society status more than my life. So I was going to let them taste exactly what life was like without my silent funding. I was going to let them choke on the reality of their own poverty, and when they finally realized what they had lost, I was going to be the one standing over the ashes of their fake empire. Malik did not waste a single second. Within an hour, he had coordinated a discreet medical transport. I was moved from the bustling, chaotic floors of Atlanta General to a highly secure private recovery suite in a boutique medical facility on the edge of Buckhead. It was the kind of place catering to professional athletes and high-profile executives who needed absolute anonymity. The transition was agonizing. Every bump in the road sent fresh waves of searing pain through my surgical incisions. But the physical agony was nothing compared to the absolute clarity settling into my mind. I was done. The loyal, obedient daughter they had exploited for a decade was dead and buried. Lying in that immaculate private suite, surrounded by fresh orchids Malik had ordered, I had nothing but time to reflect on the sheer scale of my family's financial parasitism. I had built a multi-million-dollar organic skincare brand from my kitchen table, while my parents told their megachurch congregation that I was just selling lotion on the internet. They were deeply embarrassed by my dark skin and natural hair, constantly comparing me to my lighter-skinned brother, Jamal. Jamal was their undisputed king. He was a 30-year-old man whose entire existence was a carefully curated illusion of black excellence. In reality, he had never held a job for more than 6 months. He called himself an entrepreneur, but his startup companies were just expensive hobbies I ended up funding to keep the peace. When Jamal brought home Brittany, I became the ultimate silent sponsor of their lifestyle. Brittany came from a family in Greenwich who projected generational wealth, but actually had a mountain of hidden debt. She loved playing the role of the affluent Southern belle in Atlanta, happily swiping the platinum credit card she thought belonged to my parents. She had no idea that the 3-carat diamond sitting on her finger was paid for by the very same dark-skinned sister she routinely talked down to at family dinners. My parents had sworn me to secrecy about my wealth. They convinced me that if the church or their high society friends knew I was the one paying the mortgage on their 6-bedroom estate, it would emasculate my father. Calvin was a man whose pride demanded he look like the king of the castle, even if his daughter was secretly paying for the bricks. For years, I accepted that toxic arrangement because I desperately craved their love. I thought if I just provided enough stability, if I just bought them enough peace of mind, they would eventually look at me the way they looked at Jamal. That illusion died the moment my mother chose a golf tournament and a lobster dinner over my bleeding body in the emergency room. On my 4th day in the private clinic, I scheduled a video call with my wealth management team. Malik sat beside my bed, reviewing the spreadsheets. I stared at the screen and gave the orders with a steady, unwavering voice. I watched the financial guillotine drop. We severed the blind trust that automatically paid Calvin and Brenda's monthly country club dues. We canceled the massive recurring tithes to their megachurch, the very tithes that secured their front-row VIP seating every Sunday. I instructed my bank to flag the black credit card Brenda carried as permanently closed. The most satisfying moment was cutting off the corporate seed money account for Jamal. I watched the balance on his business account go from a comfortable cushion to absolute zero in a matter of seconds. I felt a profound sense of liberation with every account we liquidated. I was taking back my power, dollar by dollar. They had built a massive house of cards on my back, and I had just walked away, leaving it to collapse under its own weight. It took a full 7 days after my near-fatal surgery for my family to finally decide I was worth a visit. Malik had paid a contact at the administration desk of Atlanta General to alert us the moment the Washington family arrived. I was sitting up in my recovery bed drinking herbal tea when Malik's phone buzzed with the update. He read the text message, and a dark smirk crossed his face. "They just walked into the hospital lobby," Malik announced. "Brenda, Calvin, Jamal, and Brittany. They are complaining loudly about the traffic on Peachtree Street and demanding the staff point them to your room. They brought a single grocery store balloon." I took a slow sip of my tea. What did they find when they got upstairs? Malik typed a quick message and waited for the reply. He chuckled softly. "The nurses just directed them to your former room." They walked into a completely stripped, sterilized space. The bed is made, the monitors are off. I had made sure of exactly what they would find. Before I was transferred out of that hospital, I had asked a sympathetic nurse for a piece of stationery. I wrote a single sentence on it and paid her to leave it perfectly centered on the tray table in that empty room. I imagined the look on my mother's face as she picked up that piece of paper, expecting an apology for my dramatic behavior. Instead, she found my final message to them. "I died that night. Do not look for a ghost." According to Malik's contact, the panic was immediate. Brenda started screaming at the nurse's station, demanding to know where I had been moved. Calvin tried to use his booming, authoritative voice to intimidate the hospital administrator into releasing my medical records. But I had placed strict confidentiality locks on my file under federal privacy laws. The hospital staff legally could not confirm if I had been transferred, discharged, or if I had actually passed away. The realization that they had lost complete control over me must have hit them like a freight train. But the true reality check did not happen in the hospital corridors. It happened 20 minutes later, down in the valet parking line. Malik read the final update from his contact and laughed out loud. "They stormed out of the hospital, furious and panicked," Malik reported. "Brenda handed the valet your platinum card to pay the parking fee and get their luxury SUV. The machine declined it. She tried to swipe it 3 times. The valet told her the account was closed. Calvin had to dig through his pockets to find cash to get their own car back." A deep, warm sense of vindication settled into my chest. The hospital visit was supposed to be their way of checking a box, a quick 10-minute appearance to secure their ongoing funding before heading off to a wedding tasting. They walked in expecting to find a desperate, submissive daughter eager for their scraps of attention. They walked out with an empty room, a cryptic note, and the sudden, terrifying realization that their money was gone. This was just the opening move. I knew my family better than anyone. They would not grieve my absence. They would grieve the loss of their lifestyle. The panic over a declined valet ticket was nothing compared to what was coming when the real bills started bouncing. I leaned back against my pillows and closed my eyes, allowing myself to rest. I was healing physically and emotionally. The toxic weight I had carried for my entire adult life was gone. I was finally ready to watch their fake empire burn. Malik did not hesitate. He did not ask if I was sure or tell me to sleep on it. He just nodded and took the device from my hands. He stepped out into the bright, sterile hallway of the intensive care unit, and I watched through the glass as he made the phone calls that would completely detonate my family's fabricated reality. I lay back against the stiff hospital pillows and stared at the acoustic ceiling tiles. For 10 long years, I had carried the suffocating weight of the Washington family image. I paid the massive mortgage on their 6-bedroom estate in Buckhead just so my father Calvin could boast to his fraternity brothers about his generational wealth. I covered their luxury car leases. I funded Jamal's endless string of failed tech startups because my mother Brenda insisted a black man needed seed money to command respect in this world. And then there was Brittany, his pristine white fiancée from Greenwich. She was currently planning a $150,000 wedding on a platinum credit card that had my name on the account. They all treated me like a glorified administrative assistant who managed to scrape together a few nice bonuses. They had absolutely no idea that the organic skincare line I formulated in my tiny kitchen had been acquired by a major beauty conglomerate, leaving me with a net worth they could not even fathom. By day 5, my medical team cleared me for a discreet discharge. The physical pain from the emergency surgery was a constant, sharp burning in my lower abdomen, but it was nothing compared to the profound, hollow quiet in my chest. 5 days had passed. 120 hours. Not a single person from my bloodline had tried to breach the hospital doors to see if I was breathing. They were too busy tasting wedding cakes and selecting floral arrangements. Before I was loaded into the private medical transport, I asked the charge nurse for a plain sheet of paper and a pen. My hands were shaking from the heavy dose of pain medication, but my mind was crystal clear. I wrote one single sentence on that paper. I folded it once and handed the nurse a crisp $100 bill, asking her to leave it perfectly centered on the tray table of my room. Malik brought me to my actual home. It was a sprawling modern penthouse in the heart of the city, with floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Atlanta skyline. My family thought I lived in a cramped garden-level apartment in the suburbs. I had maintained that fake address for years, simply to avoid their relentless greed and unannounced visits. Now, sitting in a plush velvet armchair with a heating pad pressed to my stomach, I watched the city lights flicker to life. The silence of my sanctuary was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was coming. It was precisely a full week after my surgery when the storm finally hit. I was sipping ginger tea while reviewing next quarter projections when Malik walked into my living room holding his cell phone. A slow, dangerous smile was spreading across his face. He had paid a hefty tip to a front desk administrator at the hospital to keep us informed of any visitors. "They are here," Malik announced, his voice laced with dark amusement. "Brenda, Calvin, Jamal, and the lovely Brittany have just graced the hospital lobby with their presence." I set my teacup down. My heart gave a singular, heavy thud before settling into a cold, steady rhythm. "Paint the picture for me," I said. Malik tapped his screen, reading the text messages from his contact. They walked in, complaining loudly about the traffic on Peachtree Street. Brenda is wearing her Sunday best, throwing her weight around at the reception desk, demanding VIP treatment. Calvin is pacing and checking his gold watch, because they apparently have a cake tasting to get to in an hour. Brittany is tagging along, carrying a cheap foil balloon from a grocery store. Jamal is just standing there, scrolling through his phone, probably looking for the wire transfer he asked you for. A full week. They had waited an entire week to check on a ruptured ectopic pregnancy because it did not fit their social calendar. They assumed I was just lying in a hospital bed waiting to apologize for inconveniencing them. They assumed I was waiting to hand over my credit card so they could continue funding their delusion. "What is happening now?" I asked, leaning forward. Malik watched his screen intently. "The receptionist told them you were no longer a patient on that floor." Brenda started screaming. She threatened to call the hospital board of directors, claiming they were disrespecting a prominent Atlanta family. The charge nurse, the one you gave the note to, stepped in. She told them they were welcome to go up to the room and see for themselves. I closed my eyes, picturing the exact layout of that sterile room. I imagined the 4 of them marching out of the elevator, their designer shoes clicking against the linoleum, expecting to find me hooked up to machines, eager for their scraps of affection. I imagined Brenda pushing the heavy wooden door open, ready with a harsh reprimand about how my medical emergency had stressed her out. "They are in the room," Malik said softly. I opened my eyes. The anticipation was electric. I knew exactly what they were looking at. A freshly made hospital bed, monitors switched off and completely silent. No flowers, no personal belongings, just a pristine, empty space and that single folded piece of paper resting on the metal tray table. I could see Brenda snatching it up. I could see Calvin leaning over her shoulder to read it. I could see the exact moment the blood drained from their faces as they read the only words I had left for them. I died that night. Do not look for a ghost. Malik's phone buzzed again. He let out a sharp laugh. Brenda just demanded to know if you passed away. The nurse informed them that due to strict privacy laws, she cannot confirm if the patient was discharged, transferred, or deceased. She told them they would have to contact your legal next of kin. Which is impossible because you legally removed them from all your medical directives 3 days ago. They were locked out. For the first time in their lives, they had absolutely no access to me, no control, no way to manipulate my emotions. But the real panic, the raw, visceral terror that was about to hit them had nothing to do with my mortality. It had everything to do with their money. They are heading down to the lobby, Malik reported, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Calvin is yelling at Jamal to call your cell phone. Jamal is realizing the number is completely disconnected. They are rushing to leave. Brenda is telling Brittany not to worry about the floral deposits because they will just put it on the platinum card until they find out which hospital you move to. I leaned back in my chair. The trap was set and the jaws were about to snap shut. Tell me when they hit the valet, I whispered. We waited in silence. The minutes stretched out thick and heavy. I thought about all the times I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. The times I sat at the end of the table while Brenda praised Brittany's pale skin and straight hair, completely ignoring the dark-skinned daughter paying for the meal they were eating. I thought about my father telling me I needed to work twice as hard to be half as attractive as Jamal. Every insult, every slight, every demand for money rushed through my mind and evaporated into the cool air of my penthouse. Malik's phone vibrated continuously. It is happening, he said. The text messages were coming in rapid succession. They are at the valet stand. Brenda just handed the attendant the platinum card to pay the parking fee and bring their SUV around. The attendant swiped it. Declined. A rush of pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooded my veins. Declined, I repeated, tasting the word. It was the most beautiful word in the English language. She told the valet his machine must be broken. Malik read, his voice thick with triumph. She wiped the card on her jacket and made him swipe it again. Declined. She tried a third time, screaming at the poor kid that the card has a $50,000 limit. The valet manager stepped in and called the merchant line. They just told Brenda the account has been permanently closed by the primary account holder. The financial umbilical cord was officially severed. I could vividly picture the scene. Brenda Washington, a woman whose entire identity was wrapped up in presenting an image of flawless black wealth, standing in a crowded hospital lobby, unable to pay a $20 parking fee. I could see Calvin patting his pockets, realizing the blind trust that usually filled his checking account had vanished into thin air. I could see Brittany staring at them, her perfectly manicured hands shaking, as she realized the golden goose she was marrying into was actually entirely broke. They had to scrape together loose cash and quarters from Jamal's pockets just to get their car back, Malik said, shaking his head in disbelief. They drove off in a complete panic. The fake empire was crumbling. The foundation of lies they had built their lives upon had just been kicked out from under them. They thought they could leave me bleeding in an emergency room and come back a week later to collect their allowance? They were about to learn that actions have severe, devastating consequences. The golden child was going to have to figure out how to pay for his own lobster. My mother was going to have to face the society women at her megachurch without my money shielding her from reality. And my father was going to have to look at his bank account and realize he was nothing without the daughter he discarded. I stood up from my chair, ignoring the dull ache in my abdomen. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the sprawling canopy of Atlanta. The city was mine. The wealth was mine. The power was mine. And for the first time in my 33 years on this earth, my life was finally mine too. I woke up to the rhythmic, mechanical hissing of a ventilator and the sharp, blinding glare of fluorescent hospital lights piercing my eyelids. My body felt like it had been crushed under a concrete block. Every breath was a battle against the searing, tearing agony in my lower abdomen. I tried to move my arms, but they were weighed down by a tangle of intravenous lines, pumping fluids and pain medication into my veins. For a terrifying moment, I did not know where I was or what had happened. Then, the memory crashed into me like a freight train. I remembered the sudden, agonizing rupture in my office. I remembered the frantic ambulance ride. But most vividly of all, I remembered the sound of my mother's voice echoing through the emergency room speakerphone. I remembered Brenda telling the trauma surgeon that she could not be bothered to leave a golf tournament while I was bleeding to death. I remembered the long, high-pitched tone of the heart monitor announcing that my heart had stopped beating. I blinked against the harsh light, trying to focus my vision. I slowly turned my head, expecting to see my parents rushing to my bedside, drowning in guilt and tears. I expected to see my father Calvin holding my hand, and my brother Jamal standing in the corner looking remorseful. But the chairs designated for family were completely empty. There were no flowers. There were no frantic relatives. There was only one person sitting in the uncomfortable vinyl chair by the window. It was Malik, my business partner, and the truest friend I had ever known in my 33 years of life. Malik looked absolutely devastated. He was still wearing the same tailored suit he had on when I collapsed on the floor of our corporate headquarters, but the jacket was wrinkled and his tie was missing. He had dark circles carved under his bloodshot eyes, suggesting he had not slept a single hour since the ambulance took me away. When he saw my eyes open, he practically leaped out of his chair. He pressed the nurse call button with trembling fingers and leaned over my bed. "You scared the absolute life out of me, Chloe," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. He carefully took my hand, making sure not to disturb the IV needles. "The doctor said you lost so much blood, they almost could not bring you back. You've been unconscious in the intensive care unit for 3 entire days." 3 days. The words echoed in my foggy brain. I had been lying in a hospital bed, hovering between life and death for 72 hours. The nurses rushed into the room checking my vitals, adjusting my oxygen, and asking me questions I could barely find the strength to answer. Once they were satisfied that I was stabilized and lucid, they quietly slipped out, leaving Malik and me alone in the sterile silence. I looked around the room one more time, just to be absolutely certain. "Where are they?" I asked, my voice coming out as a weak, raspy croak. "Where is Mother?" Malik looked down at the floor, his jaw clenching so hard, a muscle feathered in his cheek. He let out a long, slow breath before meeting my eyes. His expression was a mixture of deep sorrow and barely contained rage. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out my personal cell phone, setting it gently on the tray table across my lap. "I kept it charged for you," he said quietly. "I thought maybe they would reach out to my office when they could not get a hold of you, but my phone never rang either." My hands shook as I reached for the device. The glass screen felt freezing against my fingertips. I pressed the power button and watched the screen illuminate. There were dozens of urgent emails from our production managers. There were calendar alerts for the national retail launch of my organic skincare line. There were text messages from my employees wishing me a speedy recovery. but there was not a single notification from Brenda. There was not a single missed call from Calvin. 72 long, agonizing hours had passed since a trauma surgeon explicitly told my parents that I might not survive the night, and they had not bothered to dial my number even once. They had not called the hospital. They had not come to the lobby. They simply went on with their weekend as if my life was a minor inconvenience they could easily ignore. I opened my text messages, my heart pounding against my ribs. There was exactly one message from a family member. It was from my older brother, Jamal. He had sent it late the previous night. I stared at the words on the screen, reading them over and over until they burned into my retinas. Mom said you are playing the victim at the hospital again to ruin my weekend. Can you wire me $3,000 for the celebratory dinner tonight? Brittany wants lobster, and her parents are expecting top-tier service from us. Do not ignore this, Chloe. I did not cry. I thought the betrayal would break me into a million pieces, but instead, a strange, freezing calm washed over my entire body. I stared at the text message from a 30-year-old man demanding lobster money while his sister lay in the intensive care unit. For a decade, I had been the silent, anonymous ATM for the Washington family. I was the dark-skinned daughter they kept hidden in the background, the one they told to stay out of the sun and focus on books because I would never have Jamal's light-skin privilege or effortless charm. They built an entire identity around the illusion of Black excellence and generational wealth in Atlanta high society. They attended a massive elite megachurch where they sat in the VIP section, dripping in designer clothes and talking down to anyone they deemed beneath them. But it was all a spectacular lie. The 6-bedroom estate in Buckhead where Calvin hosted his fraternity brothers was paid for by me. The luxury SUVs Brenda drove to her high society brunches were leased under my corporate accounts. Jamal's endless string of failed tech startups were entirely funded by the seed money I quietly wired to his business accounts just to keep my parents from begging me for cash. And then there was Brittany, his pristine white fiancée from Greenwich. She loved playing the role of the affluent Southern belle, treating our family like a trendy, exotic accessory. She paraded around Atlanta swiping a platinum credit card she thought belonged to my wealthy parents. She had absolutely no idea that her 3-carat diamond engagement ring and her upcoming $150,000 country club wedding were being entirely financed by the very same sister she routinely dismissed and belittled at family dinners. My parents had sworn me to absolute secrecy about my wealth. When I launched my skincare brand from my kitchen table and grew it into a massive empire, they begged me not to tell anyone. They convinced me that if their church friends or their country club associates knew I was the one paying their bills, it would completely emasculate my father. Calvin's pride demanded he look like the king of his castle, even if his dark-skinned daughter was secretly buying the bricks. I had accepted that toxic, degrading arrangement for years because I was desperate for their love. I naively believed that if I just provided enough financial stability, if I just bought them enough peace of mind, they would eventually look at me the way they looked at Jamal. That pathetic illusion died the moment Brenda chose a golf tournament over my bleeding body. I had sacrificed my youth, my peace, and my self-respect to fund the lifestyle of people who would not even step off a manicured putting green to watch me take my last breath. I was nothing but a workhorse to them, a disposable bank account that was only valuable as long as it kept dispensing cash. I looked up at Malik. He was watching my face closely, clearly expecting me to shatter into pieces and start sobbing. He was ready to offer comfort, ready to tell me how unfair and cruel they were. But the woman who desperately craved her mother's approval had died on that operating table 3 days ago. The woman who woke up in this hospital bed was someone entirely different. I unplugged the charging cable from the bottom of the phone. I did not shed a single tear. My hands were no longer shaking. I looked directly into Malik's eyes and handed the device back to him. Wipe it, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, unwatering whisper. Malik blinked his brow, furrowing in confusion. Wipe the phone. Factory reset it, I commanded. Erase every single contact, every message, every trace of them. Then contact my wealth management team immediately. I want the blind trust that pays the mortgage on the Buckhead estate completely liquidated. I want the massive recurring tithes to their megachurch canceled today. Flag the platinum credit cards Brenda and Jamal carry as permanently closed. Cut off the corporate seed money account for Jamal's fake startup company and drain the balance. Cancel the auto drafts. Cancel the country club dues. Cancel every single financial thread connecting my empire to their lives. Malik's eyes widened in sheer shock. Chloe, he stammered, taking the phone. If you cut off the money right now, without warning, they are going to lose absolutely everything. They will not be able to pay for the wedding. They will not even be able to buy groceries by next week. I leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows, staring at the blank wall across the room. That is exactly the point, I replied. They left me to die, Malik. My mother literally told the trauma surgeon she would come tomorrow if I was still here. Well, I am not here anymore. The family bank is permanently closed. Find me a highly secure private recovery facility on the edge of the city, a place where they cannot track me down. When they finally decide to show up at this hospital to ask for their allowance, I want this room completely stripped and empty. We are disappearing today. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Malik's face as he finally understood the magnitude of what I was doing. He nodded once, executing the factory reset on the phone with a decisive tap of his finger. Consider it done, he said. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to finally rest. I was physically broken, but my spirit had never felt so terrifyingly free. They cared about their high society image more than my heartbeat. So I was going to let them taste exactly what life was like without my silent protection. I was going to let them choke on the reality of their own poverty, and when their fake empire finally burned to the ground, I would be the one holding the matches. My sanctuary in Buckhead was everything my parents desperately pretended to have but could never actually afford. I owned the entire top floor of a sleek glass high-rise with panoramic views of the city. Custom imported marble lined the floors, and private elevators opened directly into my foyer. My family thought I lived in a cramped, garden-level apartment right off a noisy highway in the suburbs. I let them believe that fiction for a decade because I knew exactly what would happen if they discovered the truth. Brenda and Calvin would have moved themselves in, changed the locks, and claimed my success as their own personal property. Keeping my wealth hidden was the only way I maintained my sanity. Now wrapped in a cashmere robe, while my surgical incisions slowly healed, I realized this penthouse was not just a home. It was a fortress they could never breach. Monday morning arrived and brought with it the absolute financial devastation I had orchestrated. The weekend was officially over, and the banks opened for regular business. At exactly 9 in the morning, the automated clearinghouse transfers I usually sent to maintain their lifestyle were blocked. The massive direct deposit for their 6-bedroom estate bounced. The luxury car leases for their matching imported SUVs bounced. The country club monthly maintenance fees bounced. Malik had brought his laptop to my penthouse so we could work side by side while I recovered. We set up a mobile command center at my massive dining table. At 10:15 in the morning, Malik looked at his cell phone as it began to buzz aggressively on the marble surface. It was the direct emergency line to our corporate office, which he had forwarded to his personal phone for the week. He picked it up and showed me the screen. The caller identification flashed my father's name. Calvin Washington. Malik hit the speaker button and set the phone back down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "This is Malik," he answered, his voice professional and completely devoid of warmth.
"Where is she?"
Calvin bellowed into the receiver. His voice was booming thick with the arrogant entitlement he usually reserved for waiters and valet attendants. I want to speak to Chloe right now. I have been calling her cell phone all weekend and the line is disconnected. Tell her to pick up the phone, Malik. I know she is hiding in that little office of yours. Mr. Washington Chloe is currently on an indefinite leave of absence, Malik replied smoothly. She is completely unreachable. Is there a business matter I can help you with today? A business matter, Calvin scoffed, a harsh, mocking sound vibrating through the speaker. My cards are declining all over Atlanta. My mortgage payment was reversed this morning. The country club just called me asking for an alternate form of payment because the account on file is frozen. I know exactly what is going on here. Her little lotion hustle finally went bankrupt, did it not? I told her years ago that selling homemade grease on the internet was not a real career. Now she has ruined my credit because her little hobby collapsed. Tell her she needs to fix this today, or I am driving down to that office to handle her myself. I sat across the table, sipping my hot lemon water, marveling at the sheer audacity of the man. His daughter had nearly bled to death in a hospital bed 7 days ago, and his first instinct was not to ask if I was alive. His first instinct was to berate my business and demand I fix his luxury car payments. He honestly believed my organic skincare empire, which was distributed in over 2,000 high-end retail stores nationwide, was just a failing side hustle, Mr. Washington Malik said, his tone dropping 10 degrees colder. Chloe's company did not go bankrupt. The company is experiencing its most profitable quarter in history. The accounts were not frozen due to a lack of funds. They were permanently closed by the primary account holder. Chloe intentionally severed your access to her wealth. You no longer have an allowance. Furthermore, our corporate headquarters has armed security in the lobby. If you attempt to show up there, you will be escorted off the premises by the police. Do not call this number again. Malik ended the call and blocked the number before Calvin could utter a single word in response. We sat in silence for a moment before I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The king of the castle had just been locked out of the treasury. I could only imagine the absolute panic spiraling through his chest as he realized he would have to face his wealthy fraternity brothers, knowing he could not even afford to buy a round of drinks. But Calvin was only the first domino to fall. The real toxicity of my family dynamic revealed itself the very next afternoon. I was resting on my sofa, reviewing product packaging designs on my tablet, when a notification popped up on my screen. It was an urgent voicemail forwarded from my corporate executive line. The system automatically flagged it because the caller had aggressively identified herself as family to my assistant. I pressed play, and the high-pitched, frantic voice of my brother's fiancé filled my living room. "Chloe, you need to call me back right now," Brittany shrieked into the phone. Her usual fake Southern sweetness was completely gone, replaced by the aggressive, demanding tone she probably used when she returned items to luxury department stores. "Jamal told me you blocked the accounts. I am standing at the premier floral boutique in Buckhead, and they are telling me the deposit for my custom bridal arrangements was rejected. You are ruining my wedding. I know exactly why you are doing this. You are being a bitter, jealous spinster. You cannot stand the fact that Jamal is getting married and building a beautiful Black excellence legacy while you are sitting alone in some tiny apartment making soap. Turn the credit cards back on immediately, Chloe. My parents are flying in from Greenwich next week for the final venue walkthrough, and I will not let your miserable single Black woman syndrome embarrass me. Fix this, or I will make sure Brenda bans you from the reception." The voicemail clicked off. I sat there in the quiet of my penthouse, staring at the tablet in my hands. I listened to it a second time, just to fully absorb the absolute delusion of this woman. Brittany, a white woman from Connecticut who married into my family for social clout, had the nerve to use racist microaggressions against me while standing in a florist shop trying to spend my money. She really believed she was superior. She believed my mother Brenda would back her up and ban me from a wedding that I was entirely financing. They had all completely lost their minds. I did not get angry. Anger was a useless emotion. I got busy. I picked up my phone and called the head of my private corporate security firm. It was an elite team composed of former federal investigators who usually handled corporate espionage and supply chain protection for my brand. I gave them a very specific personal assignment. I ordered a full comprehensive background check on Brittany and her supposedly wealthy Greenwich family. I wanted everything. Banking records, tax liens, property deeds, civil court judgments. I wanted every single skeleton hiding in their perfectly manicured closet. The security team worked fast. The encrypted dossier arrived in my secure inbox less than 24 hours later. I sat at my dining table with Malik as we opened the file and began reading through the pages. By the time I reached the third page, I threw my head back and laughed so hard my surgical incisions ached. The Great Greenwich Dynasty was a complete and absolute fraud. Brittany's parents did not have generational wealth. They were drowning in massive, insurmountable debt. Their colonial estate in Connecticut was leveraged to the hilt with 3 separate mortgages and was currently 90 days past due. Her father's boutique consulting business had recently been sued for unpaid wages by his own employees. They had multiple maxed-out credit cards and a pending tax lien from the federal government. They were entirely broke. I looked at Malik, who was reading the same document with a look of pure astonishment on his face. "Do you see this?" I asked, tapping the screen. "Brittany is not marrying Jamal for true love. She is marrying him because she thinks the Washington family has millions of dollars sitting in the bank. She thinks she found a wealthy, elite black family in Atlanta to save her from complete financial ruin. And my parents think they found a wealthy white girl with high society connections to elevate their status at the megachurch." It was the most poetic, devastating irony I had ever witnessed. They were 2 completely broke families desperately trying to scam each other into funding a luxury lifestyle. They were both putting on an elaborate performance of wealth, and I was the only person in the entire equation who actually had any real money. I closed the dossier and locked my tablet. The wedding was going to be a spectacular, historic disaster. Without my credit cards, Jamal and Brittany were going to have to face each other empty-handed. But I knew my mother better than anyone. Brenda would never let the wedding fail. She would rather die than admit to her church congregation that her golden child was broke and his bride was a fraud. She would double down. She would try to destroy me to save face and deflect the blame. And as I sat in my impenetrable fortress, high above the city, I was perfectly ready for whatever vicious lies she tried to spin next. It took 4 full weeks for the deep surgical incisions in my abdomen to finally heal. But the emotional armor I built during that time of isolation was entirely bulletproof. I spent a month hidden away in my Buckhead penthouse, restructuring my business, tightening my supply chains, and watching from afar as the financial reality of my absence slowly suffocated my family. My security team had already handed me the dossier, proving that Brittany and her Greenwich family were completely broke. Knowing that my parents and Brittany were 2 destitute families desperately trying to scam each other into funding a luxury lifestyle gave me an immense sense of clarity. The first true test of my new armor came on a crisp Saturday night in late October. The annual Heritage Excellence Gala was the undisputed crown jewel of Black high society in Atlanta. It was a massive charity event where the city elite gathered to network, display their wealth, and secure their social standing. For years, I had quietly purchased the $25,000 VIP tables for my parents under a corporate alias. It was their absolute favorite night of the year. They used it to mingle with mayors, neurosurgeons, and entertainment moguls, maintaining the grand illusion that Calvin Washington was a titan of industry. I had not canceled those specific gala tickets because they were completely non-refundable, but, more importantly, because I wanted a front row seat to the show. I wanted to see them sweating in their expensive evening wear, knowing their bank accounts were drained to absolute zero. I arrived at the grand ballroom of the St. Regis 2 hours after the doors opened. I did not want to blend into the background or hide in the shadows the way I usually did to ensure Jamal remained the center of attention. I wanted to be seen. I wore a custom-tailored emerald silk gown that draped flawlessly over my healing frame. There were no flashy designer logos, just the heavy, undeniable weight of quiet, untouchable wealth. I wore diamonds at my throat and a subtle, emerald-cut ring on my finger. Malik walked beside me looking razor-sharp in a bespoke, midnight blue tuxedo. As we stepped into the glittering ballroom, the energy around us instantly shifted. I was no longer the frumpy, tired daughter hiding in the corner holding the purses. I was Chloe Washington, the self-made CEO, and my presence commanded the room. Within minutes, we were greeted by a city councilwoman and a prominent real estate developer who both wanted to discuss my skincare brand and its upcoming national retail expansion. People knew who I was. They respected my business acumen. Out of the corner of my eye, I finally spotted them. Calvin, Brenda, Jamal, and Brittany were huddled near the back edge of the VIP section. The tension radiating off their small group was palpable, even from across the massive ballroom. Calvin was aggressively downing a glass of bourbon, his posture rigid and defensive. Jamal looked completely frantic, constantly checking his cell phone, probably waiting for fake angel investors to wire him money that simply did not exist. Brittany looked absolutely miserable. Her fake pageant smile was plastered on her face as she awkwardly tried to mingle with older women who were dripping in actual generational wealth. Then Brenda turned her head. I watched her perfectly manicured facade crack right down the middle. She abruptly abandoned her conversation with a prominent megachurch elder and locked eyes with me. The sheer audacity of my appearance sent her into a visible tailspin. The fact that I was glowing healthy and draped in expensive silk while she was rationing her checking account to buy gas for her luxury SUV broke her brain. She did not hesitate. She marched across the ballroom floor, moving with a furious, determined stride. Her eyes were dark with unadulterated anger. She did not pause to ask how I was feeling. She did not ask if I had fully recovered from the massive internal hemorrhage that nearly ended my life a month ago. She stepped right into my personal space, her fingers clamping down hard on my bare forearm. She tried to physically pull me toward a secluded, dimly lit alcove near the coat check, desperate to avoid a public scene while unleashing her venom. I let her guide me out of the main eyeline. Malik trailed a few steps behind us, positioning himself as a silent, imposing barrier between me and the rest of the gala attendees. He watched my mother like a hawk, ready to intervene the second I gave the signal.
How dare you?
Brenda hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage. How dare you show your face here, looking like that, while your brother is struggling? You embarrassed us at the hospital, Chloe. You made us look like absolute fools in front of the nursing staff, leaving that ridiculous, dramatic note in your empty room. And now you are parading around Atlanta in designer gowns trying to humiliate your father? She dug her acrylic nails into my arm, her face twisting into a mask of pure, selfish entitlement. You turn those accounts back on right now. Jamal's wedding venue deposits are bouncing all over the city. Brittany is threatening to cancel the country club reservation because the vendors are demanding cash up front. You are ruining your brother's life over a petty, jealous temper tantrum. We are your family. You owe us your respect and your financial support. I looked down at the hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away frantically or shrink back the way I would have done a year ago. I reached over with my free hand and peeled her fingers off my skin, one by one, moving with agonizing, deliberate slowness. I smoothed out the emerald silk of my sleeve and met her furious gaze with a perfectly calm, chilling smile. My heart was beating steadily. There was no fear left inside me. Embarrassed, I asked my voice, carrying a soft, lethal edge that made her flinch. You want to talk to me about being embarrassed? Let us talk about my college graduation, Brenda. Let us talk about the day I graduated summa cum laude with a dual degree in business and chemistry while working 2 jobs to support myself. Do you remember what you told the entire extended family at my celebration dinner? You stood up at the head of the table, ignored my degrees, and raised your glass to toast Jamal's generic communications degree. Brenda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She tried to take a step back, but the wall of the alcove stopped her. You told a room full of people that his C average was actually much more impressive than my academic honors. I continued stepping closer, so she could not escape the weight of my words. You looked right at me and said men need the confidence more to succeed in this world, while women just need to know how to follow directions and support their brothers. You humiliated me on the proudest day of my young life, just to stroke the ego of a man who has never worked a hard day in his entire existence. I followed your directions for a decade. I whispered the truth, landing like heavy blows. I funded your entire fake life. I paid the mortgage on the house you sleep in. I paid for the very ticket that got you into this VIP room tonight. I bought your clothes, your cars, and your church status. But the directions permanently changed the night you left me to bleed out in a trauma bay because a golf tournament was more important than my pulse. Brenda stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and realization. She finally understood that the well had run completely dry. She could not bully or guilt me into submission anymore because I no longer cared about her affection. Jamal is not struggling, Mother, I said, my voice dropping to a final definitive tone. He is just experiencing reality for the very first time. You all are. You wanted to build a legacy of black excellence on my back, but you forgot that I am the one who actually owns the bricks. Enjoy the gala tonight. I highly recommend taking advantage of the open bar because it is the last free drink you will ever get from me. I turned my back on her, leaving her completely paralyzed in the shadows of the coat check area. I walked back into the glittering ballroom bathed in the warm light of the crystal chandeliers. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and rejoined Malik, who offered me a slight, approving nod. As I mingled with city officials and potential business partners, I felt a profound, soaring sense of peace. The financial cord was cut, but tonight I had finally severed the emotional chains. I was no longer a victim of their toxic narrative. I was the author of my own life, and I was just getting started. I left my mother frozen in the shadows of the coat check and glided back into the radiant warmth of the St. Regis ballroom. The air in my lungs had never tasted so sweet. I caught Malik looking my way from across the room and gave him a subtle nod, indicating I was going to step away for a moment. I needed a few minutes of quiet to process the absolute triumph of finally speaking my truth. I made my way down the opulent, mirrored hallway toward the private ladies' lounge. The powder room was a massive sanctuary of floor-to-ceiling marble, trimmed with gold fixtures and plush velvet seating areas. It was completely empty when I walked in. I stepped up to the grand vanity mirror, smoothing a stray hair and adjusting the emerald silk of my gown. I took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling the steady, reliable rhythm of my heart. The heavy wooden door swung open with aggressive force. The sharp, frantic clicking of designer heels echoed against the marble floor. I looked through the mirror and saw Brittany marching toward me. Her face was flushed an angry, patchy red under her expensive makeup. She looked completely unhinged. The polite Southern belle facade she usually wore like a mask had completely evaporated. She marched right up to the vanity, standing just a few feet away from me, with her hands planted firmly on her hips. She was breathing heavily, clearly trying to summon the authority she thought she held by being engaged to the golden child of the Washington family. "I think your little stunt out there was absolutely pathetic," Chloe Brittany snapped, her voice vibrating with toxic entitlement. "Brenda just told Jamal that you threatened her. You are seriously going to stand in a luxury hotel and throw a tantrum because you are jealous of my wedding? Jamal is under an immense amount of stress right now, trying to fix whatever banking error you caused with his business accounts. You need to stop acting like a bitter single woman and fix the credit cards tonight." I slowly turned around to face her. I leaned back against the cool marble counter, crossing my arms. I did not say a word. I just let her talk, watching her dig her own grave deeper with every single breath. Her arrogance was truly a spectacle to behold. She honestly believed her proximity to my light-skinned brother and her own white privilege gave her the right to bark orders at me. She thought she was speaking to the family mule, the dark-skinned sister who was supposed to remain in the shadows and happily fund her spotlight. "Listen to me very carefully," Brittany continued, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. "My parents are flying down from Greenwich next week. They expect to see the floral mock-ups and the final menu tasting at the country club. I am not going to let your miserable attitude ruin the most important season of my life. So here is what we are going to do. You are going to wire $50,000 directly to my wedding planner by Monday morning to cover the bounce deposits. If you do that, I will personally talk to Brenda. I will convince her to let you attend the reception. We can put you at a table in the back so you do not have to feel left out of the family photos. It is a very generous compromise, Chloe. Take it." She stood there, staring at me, with her chin raised, waiting for me to eagerly accept her crumbs of inclusion. She thought offering me a seat at a back table at my own brother's wedding was a masterclass in negotiation. I looked at her perfectly styled blonde hair, her 3-carat diamond ring, and her trembling hands. I did not feel insulted. I felt a profound, clinical amusement. A soft, genuine laugh escaped my lips, echoing loudly in the quiet bathroom. I shook my head, looking at her with pure, unadulterated pity. "You really think you are the prize here, do you not?" I asked, my voice dropping to a calm conversational volume that made her immediately defensive. "You actually believe you hold some sort of social leverage over me?" Brittany scoffed, crossing her arms to mirror my posture. "I am marrying Jamal. I am going to be a Washington. My family comes from Greenwich high society, and we do not tolerate this kind of ghetto financial drama. You should be grateful I am even offering you a seat at my wedding after how you just treated your mother." I reached into the hidden pocket of my silk gown and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the encrypted security dossier my private investigators had sent me. I tapped the screen a few times, pulling up the financial summaries. "Greenwich High Society," I repeated, tasting the ridiculous lie on my tongue. "That is a fascinating narrative, Brittany. It really is, but I prefer nonfiction. I hired a team of former federal investigators to look into your family yesterday. Let us talk about what they found." Brittany dropped her arms. Her eyes darted to my phone and then back to my face. The angry red flush on her cheeks began to drain away, leaving her looking pale and sick. "Your parents do not have generational wealth," I said, reading the facts with surgical precision. "Your father's boutique consulting firm is currently facing a massive class action lawsuit for unpaid wages. Your family estate in Connecticut is leveraged to the absolute limit with 3 separate mortgages, and it is currently 90 days past due. Your mother has 4 maxed-out credit cards, and the federal government just placed a tax lien on your parents' joint checking accounts. You do not have a trust fund, Brittany. You do not have high society money. You are completely broke." She took a physical step back, bumping into a velvet lounge chair. Her mouth open, but she could not find any words. She looked like all the air had been violently sucked out of her lungs. You came down to Atlanta looking for a wealthy black family to save you from complete financial ruin. I continued stepping closer so she could not escape the reality of my words. You targeted Jamal because he wore expensive watches and drove imported cars. You thought you hit the jackpot. You thought you found an elite family to fund your luxury lifestyle and pay off your parents' debts.
That is a lie,
Brittany whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. You are making this up because you are jealous. Jamal is a tech entrepreneur. He has millions in seed funding. He is going to take care of me. My parents just have a temporary cash flow issue. Jamal is going to fix it. I laughed again, a sharp, cutting sound. Jamal does not have a single dime to his name, Brittany. He has never had a dime. Every single startup he ever launched failed within 6 months. He is a 30-year-old man who still asks his mother for an allowance. I held up my phone, turning the large screen toward her face. I opened the banking application that managed the blind trust. I showed her the screen displaying the exact routing numbers for Calvin and Brenda's massive Buckhead estate. I showed her the history of deposits, and then I showed her the massive red banner indicating the account was permanently closed. I swiped to the next document, revealing the digital foreclosure warning that was automatically generated when the direct deposit bounced that morning. Look at the screen, Brittany, I commanded, my voice cracking like a whip. Read the name of the primary account holder funding the Washington Family Trust. She stared at the bright screen. Her eyes scanned the legal documents, tracing the routing numbers and the legal ownership titles. She saw my name listed as the sole proprietor of the estate. She saw my name listed as the primary backer on Jamal's corporate accounts. I watched her perfectly constructed world shatter into a million tiny, jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. You are marrying into a bankrupt family, Brittany. I whispered the truth, landing with devastating finality. Your high society wedding, your 3-carat engagement ring, the luxury car you drove here in tonight, it is all entirely funded by me. And I just cut the cord. She grabbed the edge of the marble sink, her knuckles turning stark white as she tried to support her own weight. She was hyperventilating, taking short, ragged gasps of air. Her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. She looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just snapped shut. You are entirely broke, I said softly, stepping right into her line of vision, so she had to look at me. Jamal is entirely broke. Brenda and Calvin are entirely broke. They have been lying to you about their wealth, just as much as you have been lying to them about yours. You are 2 destitute families, desperately trying to scam each other, and I am the only person in this entire equation who actually has any money. Please, Brittany gasped, tears welling up in her eyes and spilling over her expensive mascara. Please, Chloe, you cannot do this. The wedding planners are demanding the final $50,000 tomorrow. If we do not pay it, they are going to cancel the venue. My parents invited half of Greenwich. Everyone is going to know we are broke. We will be completely humiliated. I looked at the woman who just 5 minutes ago had threatened to ban me from a wedding I was paying for. She had tried to leverage my dark skin and my supposed single status to make me feel small and unworthy. She had tried to bully a woman who had just survived a massive internal hemorrhage simply because she wanted a free party. I reached over to the gold dispenser and pumped a small amount of luxury soap into my hands. I turned on the warm water and washed my hands, taking my time, carefully cleaning my fingers and rinsing them under the stream. I dried my hands on a thick monogrammed towel and tossed it gracefully onto the counter. That sounds like a situation for you, I said, smoothing my gown one last time. But, as you pointed out earlier, I am just a bitter, jealous spinster making soap in a tiny apartment. I have absolutely no idea how to handle high society financial drama. You and Jamal are going to have to figure out how to pay for that lobster all by yourselves. I turned my back on her, leaving her clutching the marble sink and sobbing hysterically into the empty room. As I walked out of the powder room and back into the glittering hallway where Malik was waiting, I felt a rush of absolute power. The fake empire was not just crumbling anymore. It was burning to the ground, and I was thoroughly enjoying the heat. The crisp October air felt incredibly refreshing as Malik and I exited the luxury hotel and stepped into our waiting car. Leaving Brittany hyperventilating in the marble powder room was the perfect conclusion to the charity gala. I sat back against the soft leather seats and watched the bright city lights of Atlanta blur past the tinted windows. For my entire life, I had been terrified of causing a scene or upsetting the delicate balance of my family. I used to physically shrink in their presence, desperate to avoid my mother's harsh critiques and my father's booming lectures. Now I was completely untouchable. I had stripped away their financial security and exposed their fraudulent existence. I knew the weekend was going to end with a spectacular crash, but I had no idea just how desperate my golden child brother was about to become. By Monday morning, the reality of their absolute poverty had fully set in. Brittany had undoubtedly run back to Jamal crying about the frozen bank accounts and the digital foreclosure warning she had seen on my phone. They had no money to pay the wedding vendors. They had no money to maintain their facade. Jamal was 30 years old and completely unequipped to handle actual adversity. My parents had spent his entire life shielding him from consequences, praising his mediocre achievements, and telling him he was destined for greatness simply because he was a light-skinned, attractive man from a good neighborhood. They had inflated his ego to the point of absolute delusion. He called himself a tech entrepreneur, but he had never written a single line of viable code. Whenever his businesses failed, my parents blamed the market, and I secretly paid his debts. Now backed into a corner with a furious fiancé and zero access to my wallet, Jamal decided to play the role of the tech genius he always pretended to be. He decided to steal from me. I was sitting in the main conference room of my corporate headquarters, going over the holiday supply chain logistics with Malik and my department heads. My office was a massive modern space with floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the bustling city below. We were in the middle of discussing international shipping rates when my lead cybersecurity engineer abruptly knocked and entered the room. His name was David, and he never interrupted executive meetings unless something catastrophic was happening on the digital front. He walked directly to my chair and handed me a secure tablet. "We have a breach attempt on the primary servers," David said, his voice low and urgent. "Someone is actively trying to bypass our firewall to access the VIP client database." The room went completely silent. The VIP client database was the absolute crown jewel of my organic skincare empire. It contained the direct contact information, purchasing histories, and private shipping addresses of thousands of high-net-worth individuals. We had celebrity clients, prominent politicians, and wealthy socialites who spent tens of thousands of dollars a year on customized wellness packages. In the hands of a rival beauty conglomerate, that list was worth an absolute fortune. Malik stood up and walked over to look at the tablet over my shoulder. "Are they inside the system?" he asked, his jaw tightening with concern. David shook his head. "No, sir. Our security protocols trapped them in the outer layer. But the intrusion method is extremely sloppy. They are using an old backdoor access code from a legacy router setup. We traced the internet protocol address immediately. It is not a foreign corporate spy or a professional syndicate. The hack is coming from a residential address in Buckhead." I looked at the specific IP address flashing in red on the tablet screen. A slow, humorless smile spread across my face. I knew that address perfectly. It was the massive 6-bedroom estate I paid for. It was my parents' house. "Jamal," I said softly, handing the tablet back to David. "My brother is trying to steal my client list to sell to a competitor. He needs fast cash to save his wedding, and he thinks he is smart enough to rob my company." Malik let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "He really thinks he is a mastermind, does he not? He thinks he can just log into our servers and walk away with our biggest asset? What do you want to do, Chloe? We can shut down his network completely. We can call the federal authorities right now." I stood up from the conference table, smoothing my tailored trousers. I did not feel panic. I did not feel fear. I just felt a deep, profound disgust for the man my parents had raised. He was perfectly willing to destroy my entire livelihood just to pay for his country club wedding reception. "Do not shut him out just yet," I commanded. I looked directly at David, my voice carrying absolute authority. "I want you to create a decoy file. Fill it with completely useless, corrupted data and label it as the master client list. Let him download it. Let him think he actually won. And the very second that download is complete, I want you to drop the hammer. Deploy a digital lockdown on his end, brick his laptop, brick his desktop, send a localized virus that completely fries every single piece of hardware on his network. I want his expensive imported computers turned into useless pieces of plastic." David nodded, a sharp professional glint in his eye. "Consider it done, Ms. Washington." He turned and rushed back to the Security Operations Center. I looked at Malik. "Call the corporate attorneys," I said. "Tell them to draft the most ruthless, aggressive cease and desist order they have ever written. Detail his exact location, his internet protocol address, and the specific felony charges related to corporate espionage and data theft. Send it to the Buckhead estate via an armed private courier. I want it hand-delivered to Jamal before lunch." The trap was executed flawlessly. Less than an hour later, David confirmed that Jamal had taken the bait, swallowed the corrupted file, and immediately had his entire network fried by our security response. 2 hours after that, I received confirmation that my private courier had knocked on the mahogany front door of my parents' house and handed a thick legal envelope directly to my brother. I returned to my private office and sat behind my desk, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, my direct private line began to ring. Only a handful of people had that specific number. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear, not saying a word. "Chloe, my father!" Calvin roared into the phone. His voice was absolutely deafening, vibrating with the toxic, arrogant fury he had used to control our household for decades. "How dare you? How dare you send armed men to my front door to threaten your brother with legal action?" I leaned back in my leather chair, staring out at the skyline. "Good afternoon, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I see Jamal received my warning." "You are completely out of your mind!" Calvin screamed, not bothering to listen to my tone. "Your brother was just trying to recover some old family photos from a shared drive, and you accused him of corporate espionage? You are trying to drag your own flesh and blood into legal trouble because you are a bitter, lonely woman. You have embarrassed your mother, you have terrified Brittany, and now you are trying to destroy your brother's reputation right before his wedding." I let him vent. I let him yell and scream and project his absolute failure of a son onto my shoulders. He had spent his entire life protecting Jamal from the consequences of his own actions. "He was trying to steal a highly classified corporate database, Dad," I replied coldly, slicing through his tirade. "He tried to rob my company so he could sell my assets to the highest bidder. He committed a federal crime. The only reason he is not currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser is because I allowed my security team to handle it internally. You should be thanking me." "I am not thanking you for anything," Calvin snarled. "You have lost your mind, Chloe. You think because you sell some overpriced lotion you can treat this family like dirt? You are a disgrace to the Washington family. We come from a long line of proud, educated Black leaders. We have a legacy in this city. You are acting like street trash. If you do not drop these ridiculous legal threats against your brother right now, I will publicly disown you. I will stand up at the church on Sunday and tell the entire congregation that you are no longer my daughter. I will strip you of the Washington family name. He threw out his ultimate weapon. For my entire childhood, the threat of being disowned was the most terrifying punishment imaginable. Calvin used the Washington name as a tool of absolute control. He believed being associated with his legacy was the greatest privilege in the world. He honestly thought the threat of public excommunication would make me break down, cry, and beg for his forgiveness. He thought I would rush to turn the credit cards back on just to remain in his good graces. I took a slow, deep breath. I felt absolutely nothing for the man screaming on the other end of the line. "The Washington name is broke, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper that made him instantly stop talking. "The legacy you are so incredibly proud of was entirely purchased by me. You do not have generational wealth. You have a daughter who felt sorry for you. I bought your house. I leased your cars. I paid for the very phone you are using to scream at me right now. And since you clearly do not understand the reality of your current situation, I suggest you open your email." "What are you talking about?" Calvin demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its arrogant, booming power. "Check your email, Dad," I repeated. "I just sent you the legal documentation. You want to disown me? Go right ahead. But you might want to look at who currently owns the mortgage on the house you are standing in. You might want to see who just bought the outstanding debt on Jamal's luxury wedding venue. Have a wonderful afternoon." I placed the receiver down gently, disconnecting the call. I did not slam it, I did not yell. I just severed the connection, leaving him to discover the absolute horror waiting in his inbox. I had warned them to leave me alone, but Jamal tried to steal from my empire. Now they were going to learn that I did not just cut off their funding. I had actively purchased their entire existence, and the eviction notices were already printed. I severed the connection, leaving my father to face the digital guillotine waiting in his inbox. I placed the receiver down on its cradle with a soft click. The heavy silence of my corporate office felt incredibly peaceful. Malik stood across my glass desk, shaking his head with a slow, admiring smile. He knew exactly what was inside that email. We had been working on this specific maneuver for weeks. Right after I was discharged from the private recovery clinic, I had a long, highly secure video conference with my primary wealth manager. I told him I wanted to aggressively diversify my investment portfolio by acquiring distressed real estate and private debt. But I had very specific targets in mind. Calvin and Brenda loved to project the image of untouchable generational wealth. They hosted massive networking events for their church leadership and elite alumni chapters at their 6-bedroom Buckhead estate. They paraded around the property acting like royalty, but their financial foundation was built on sand. My private investigators had dug into the public records and found exactly what I suspected. My parents had refinanced that house 3 separate times to pay for luxury cars and designer wardrobes. They had a massive balloon payment approaching on their primary mortgage. The bank was already getting nervous because the automated payments from my account had abruptly stopped. My wealth manager simply stepped in through an anonymous corporate entity and purchased the entire mortgage directly from the anxious lender. I bought the debt for cash. That meant I literally owned the roof over their heads. But I did not stop there. I knew the only thing they cared about more than their house was Jamal and Brittany's upcoming wedding. It was supposed to be the social event of the season. They had booked an exclusive, historic boutique hotel in Midtown Atlanta. The venue was famous for its crystal chandeliers and grand ballrooms. It was the perfect stage for their fake Black excellence performance. However, the hospitality industry was struggling, and that specific hotel had taken on a massive commercial loan to renovate their suites. The private equity firm holding that loan was looking to offload the risk. I instructed my lawyers to create another blind trust and buy the commercial paper for the hotel. It cost me a fraction of my annual marketing budget to become the primary debt holder for the entire venue. Now Calvin was sitting in his lavish home office opening the email from my legal team. I could vividly picture the scene unfolding miles away. I imagined him putting on his expensive reading glasses, expecting to see a desperate apology from a broken daughter. I imagined his eyes scanning the stark black text of the legal attachments. The first document was the formal transfer of his residential mortgage. The second document was the commercial debt ownership portfolio for the boutique hotel. The cover letter attached by my ruthless corporate attorneys was brutally brief and impossible to misunderstand. It explicitly stated that the primary debt holder had transferred all collection authority and property rights to a holding company, where I was listed as the sole proprietor. I looked at Malik as we waited for the inevitable reaction. He poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and handed one to me. They thought they held all the power because they controlled the family narrative, I said, taking a slow sip. They thought they could isolate me by spreading vicious gossip at the megachurch. They thought the threat of disowning me would bring me to my knees. Malik laughed a deep, rich sound that filled the room. They brought a knife to a nuclear launch site, he replied. They are about to learn what real power looks like. Less than 10 minutes later, the silence in my office was broken. My private line did not ring. They knew I would never pick it up again. Instead, Malik's cell phone began to vibrate wildly on the glass table. We both looked down at the screen. It was Calvin. Malik let it ring 4 times before he picked it up and hit the speaker button. He placed the phone in the center of the desk. "This is Malik," he answered, his voice perfectly neutral and professional. "Malik, please," Calvin stammered. The arrogant, booming thunder in his voice was completely gone. He sounded like a terrified, hollow shell of a man. His breath was coming in short, frantic gasps. "Tell me this is a joke. Tell me these documents are some kind of sick prank she is playing to get back at us." I could hear the absolute chaos erupting in the background of the call. Brenda was sobbing hysterically. I could hear Jamal shouting something about the hotel manager calling his cell phone. I had anticipated that move. My legal team had officially notified the hotel management about the change in commercial ownership just an hour prior. The hotel manager must have called Jamal to confirm that their wedding venue was now entirely controlled by his sister. Mr. Washington Mellick said, leaning closer to the microphone. "The documents you received are absolutely authentic and legally binding. Chloe's holding company has successfully purchased your residential mortgage and the commercial debt of the wedding venue. She owns the property you are standing in. She controls the building where your son is planning to get married. This is not a prank. It is a financial reality." "No, no, no," Calvin pleaded, his voice cracking with pure panic. "She cannot do this. We are her family. She cannot just buy our debt and hold it over our heads. It is illegal. It has to be illegal. Malik, I need to speak to her. I need to explain things to her." "You do not get to demand anything from her ever again," Malik replied coldly. "You threatened to publicly disown her less than 20 minutes ago. You called her street trash. I believe her exact response was that the Washington name is broke. It seems she provided you with the necessary proof." "Please!" Brenda shrieked, grabbing the phone from Calvin. I could hear the sheer terror in her voice. "Malik, please tell Chloe we are sorry. Tell her we did not mean any of those things. Jamal is losing his mind. Brittany is packing a suitcase right now, saying she refuses to marry into a family that does not own their own home. We need to sit down and talk about this like Christians. We need to pray on this together." I sat perfectly still, listening to my mother beg. This was the same woman who told a trauma surgeon she could not leave a golf tournament while I was bleeding internally. She did not shed a single tear when she thought I might die, but the moment she realized she might lose her luxury estate and her country club status, she was sobbing like a wounded animal. Her tears were entirely transactional. She was only crying because she was caught. "There is nothing to pray about," Mrs. Washington Malik stated, his tone completely flat and unforgiving. "Your financial status is no longer a family matter. It is a corporate matter. Chloe handles corporate matters at her headquarters." "We will come there," Brenda begged desperately. "We will drive down to your office right now. Just tell security to let us in. We need to see her face to face. We need to make this right." Malik looked at me, raising one eyebrow in a silent question. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. I was ready to see them. I was ready to let them step out of their comfortable, fake reality and walk directly into the massive empire I had built entirely without them. "You may come to the corporate headquarters," Malik said, "but you will abide by our rules. You will arrive at the main lobby at exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon. You will surrender your mobile devices to our armed security team at the front desk. You will not cause a scene, and you will not raise your voices. If you violate any of these conditions, you will be escorted off the premises by the police, and the foreclosure proceedings on your home will begin tomorrow morning. Do you understand?" Yes, we understand," Calvin answered, his voice trembling with submission. 3 o'clock, we will be there." Malik ended the call, and the room went silent again. I looked down at my hands. They were completely steady. For years, I had suffered severe anxiety whenever I knew I had to face my parents. I used to spend hours rehearsing what I would say, trying to find the perfect combination of words to avoid their harsh criticism and their cruel comparisons to Jamal. I used to physically shrink in their presence, hoping if I made myself small enough, they would finally leave me alone. That terrified little girl was gone. She had been completely burned away in the fires of their betrayal. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the massive glass window looking down at the busy Atlanta streets. I had spent 10 years building a fortress of wealth and success, while they threw parties and bragged about achievements they did not earn. They thought they could humiliate me at charity galas and spread vicious rumors about my mental health to protect their fragile egos. They underestimated me. They thought because I was quiet, because I was dark-skinned, and because I always paid the bills, that I was weak. They mistook my desperate desire for a loving family for stupidity. Now, they were going to have to walk into my building. They were going to have to look at the massive operation I owned. They were going to have to face the woman who literally held their entire future in the palm of her hand. "Let security know to expect them," I said, turning back to Malik. "And tell the receptionist not to offer them any water or coffee while they wait. I want them to be extremely uncomfortable." Malik smiled a sharp, predatory grin. He opened his laptop and began typing the security directives. I took a deep breath, feeling a profound, soaring sense of peace. The trap had closed perfectly. The panic setting in at the Buckhead estate was just the beginning of their reckoning. I was ready to watch them beg, and I was ready to show them exactly why they should have never left me to die. Let them come. Let them see the empire they tried to destroy. I was holding all the cards, and I had absolutely no intention of showing any mercy. I was bleeding out on a cold emergency room table when the trauma surgeon finally reached my mother on speakerphone. Through the blinding pain and the screaming of medical monitors, I heard the one person who was supposed to protect me let out a heavy, annoyed sigh. "We cannot leave right now," she told the doctor. "My son has a golf tournament, and his fiancé's parents just flew in from Greenwich. We will come tomorrow if she is still there." That was the exact sentence I heard before the monitors flatlined and my world went completely black. I am Chloe, 33 years old, and my family literally chose a country club appearance over my life. What they did not know was that the daughter they left to die was secretly funding their entire high society existence. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled their fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to save your own life. The pain tore through my abdomen like shredded glass. I had been working 80-hour weeks, preparing for the national retail launch of my organic skincare line, ignoring the sharp cramps for days because I had to finalize a massive distribution deal. I had to secure that deal because my parents' mortgage payment was due, and they had come to rely on my silent, anonymous financial transfers to maintain their wealthy facade in Atlanta. I collapsed right in the middle of my office. My business partner and best friend, Malik, had found me unconscious on the floor and called the ambulance. Now I was lying under the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room. A ruptured ectopic pregnancy, the doctors said. I was hemorrhaging internally. The medical staff moved around me in a frantic blur, cutting off my clothes and shouting medical terms I could barely process. Dr. Evans leaned over me, his face tight with professional panic. He asked for my emergency contact. I could barely breathe, but I managed to whisper my mother's cell phone number. I thought no matter how much my mother Brenda criticized me, no matter how much she favored my older brother Jamal, a mother would drop everything for her dying child. Dr. Evans dialed the number and put the phone on speaker, holding it near my ear so I could hear her voice. It rang 3 times before she picked up. The background noise on her end was full of clinking glasses and polite laughter. "This is Brenda Washington," she answered, using her practiced, polite society tone. "Mrs. Washington, this is Dr. Evans at Atlanta General Hospital. I have your daughter Chloe here. She has suffered a severe internal hemorrhage from a ruptured ectopic pregnancy. We are rushing her into emergency surgery right now. Her condition is critical. You and your husband need to get here immediately." The silence on the other end of the line was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I waited for the gasp. I waited for the panic. I waited for my mother to ask if I was going to survive. Instead, I heard her cover the receiver and whisper something to my father, Calvin. When she returned to the call, her voice was dripping with absolute irritation. "Doctor, we are at the country club right now," she said. "Jamal is playing in the alumni golf tournament finals in 20 minutes. His fiancée, Brittany, is here, and her parents just flew down to meet us. They are a very prominent white family from Greenwich, and we are hosting them. We cannot just leave and cause a scene. Chloe has a habit of being overly dramatic about her health to get attention." Dr. Evans looked at me with sheer horror in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rising in disbelief, "I do not think you understand. Your daughter has lost a massive amount of blood. She is going into hypovolemic shock. She may not make it through the night." I felt the last ounce of my strength draining away, but my mind was sharply focused on the phone. "Look," Dr. Brenda sighed heavily, as if she were speaking to a nuisance telemarketer. "Tell her we are praying for her. We will come tomorrow if she is still there." The line clicked dead. She hung up. She hung up on a trauma surgeon telling her that her daughter was dying. She hung up because Jamal was playing golf and she needed to impress Brittany's wealthy parents. Jamal was 30 years old, a golden child who had never held a steady job, constantly launching failed startup companies that I ended up quietly funding just to keep my parents from begging me for money. Brittany was his aesthetic prize, a blonde woman who treated our family like an exotic accessory, completely unaware that the Washington family wealth was entirely manufactured by the dark-skinned sister they treated like a peasant. My vision began to tunnel. The last thing I saw was Dr. Evans shouting for a crash cart. The last sound I heard was the long, continuous tone of the heart monitor announcing that my heart had stopped. I flatlined. In that dark void between life and death, I realized the devastating truth. I had spent my entire life trying to buy the love of people who would not even step off a golf course to watch me take my last breath. I woke up to the rhythmic, mechanical hissing of a ventilator and the sharp, blinding glare of fluorescent hospital lights piercing my eyelids. My body felt like it had been crushed under a concrete block. Every breath was a battle against the searing, tearing agony in my lower abdomen. I tried to move my arms, but they were weighed down by a tangle of intravenous lines, pumping fluids and pain medication into my veins. For a terrifying moment, I did not know where I was or what had happened. Then the memory crashed into me like a freight train. I remembered the sudden, agonizing rupture in my office. I remembered the frantic ambulance ride, but most vividly of all, I remembered the sound of my mother's voice echoing through the emergency room speakerphone. I remembered Brenda telling the trauma surgeon that she could not be bothered to leave a golf tournament while I was bleeding to death. I remembered the long, high-pitched tone of the heart monitor announcing that my heart had stopped beating. My parents being escorted out of my corporate headquarters was only the first tremor of the massive financial earthquake I had triggered. While Brenda and Calvin were driving back to their foreclosed estate in a state of absolute shock, the financial shockwaves were finally hitting the golden child. For years, Jamal had masqueraded as a tech visionary in the affluent circles of Atlanta. He rented a trendy co-working space in Midtown, wore tailored designer suits, and threw around empty corporate buzzwords like synergy and disruptive innovation to impress his peers. But his entire venture capital firm was a complete mirage. I was the phantom investor, artificially keeping his credit lines open and his business accounts flush with cash. When I permanently liquidated that seed money account and revoked my corporate guarantee, it triggered an automatic and devastating audit from his actual minority investors. By Tuesday morning, the house of cards collapsed entirely. The auditors discovered that Jamal had been commingling business funds with his personal checking account for years. He had illegally used investor capital to pay for Britney's 3-carat diamond engagement ring. He had used business funds to lease his imported sports cars and pay for luxury vacations to the Caribbean. The sudden withdrawal of my hidden funds left a glaring, massive hole in his balance sheets. The minority investors immediately pulled their backing and notified the authorities. The Securities and Exchange Commission was suddenly knocking on his door, asking very pointed questions about federal wire fraud and embezzlement. The golden boy of the Washington family was no longer a prominent entrepreneur. He was a desperate, terrified man staring down the barrel of a decade in federal prison. Wednesday afternoon, I was having a high-stakes business lunch at one of the most exclusive luxury steakhouses in Buckhead. I was meeting with the vice president of a massive international beauty retailer. We were sitting at a private corner booth, sipping sparkling water, and discussing the global expansion of my organic skincare line into European markets. The restaurant was filled with wealthy executives, local politicians, and prominent Atlanta socialites, enjoying their midday meals in a hushed, elegant atmosphere. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant swung open with violent force. I looked up and saw my brother pushing past the frantic hostess. Jamal looked absolutely unhinged. The perfectly groomed, arrogant tech founder was completely gone. His expensive designer shirt was wrinkled and untucked. His eyes were bloodshot, his face was glistening with sweat, and he was breathing heavily like a man running out of oxygen. He scanned the dining room with manic energy until his eyes locked directly onto me. He marched across the dining room floor, causing several prominent guests to stop eating and stare in shock. He slammed his hands down on the crisp white tablecloth of my booth, rattling the crystal glasses and silver silverware. He did not care that I was sitting with a major corporate executive. He did not care about the public spectacle he was creating. He pointed a shaking finger right in my face and started screaming at the top of his lungs. "You are trying to ruin my life, Chloe." Jamal roared, his voice cracking with toxic desperation and fury. "You cut off my funding and tipped off the federal investigators, did you not? You set me up. You are nothing but a bitter, lonely woman who cannot stand to see a black man succeeding in this world. You are jealous because I am getting married and building a legacy while you have absolutely nobody. You are trying to destroy my wedding and send me to prison because you are miserable and pathetic." The entire restaurant went dead silent. The soft jazz music playing over the speakers felt entirely inadequate to cover the tension radiating from our table. The vice president sitting across from me looked completely horrified by the sudden aggressive outburst. 10 years ago, I would have instantly shrunk into my seat. I would have pulled out my checkbook and paid his debts right then and there just to stop him from causing a public scene. I would have done absolutely anything to protect the precious Washington family image from public scrutiny. But as I sat there, looking at the pathetic, sweating man who used to mock my dark skin and natural hair, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical amusement. I turned to my guest and offered a polite, apologetic smile. I told the executive that my brother was currently experiencing a severe mental health crisis due to his failing business, and asked if she would excuse us for exactly 2 minutes. The executive quickly gathered her belongings and stepped away to the bar, giving me a respectful, understanding nod. I was left alone at the table with Jamal, who was still breathing heavily and trying to look intimidating, looming over my table like a desperate bully. I picked up my glass of sparkling water, taking a slow, refreshing sip before setting it down gently on the coaster. Then I reached into the leather designer tote bag sitting on the empty chair beside me. I pulled out a thick, sleek black folder and slid it across the white tablecloth directly into his trembling hands. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that forced him to lean down just to hear me. "You did this to yourself, Jamal," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly controlled. "You committed federal wire fraud to buy a wedding ring for a woman who was completely broke. You stole from your own investors because you are incapable of earning an honest dollar. But that is not even the worst of your problems right now. Open the folder." Jamal stared at the black folder as if it were a venomous snake. He opened it with trembling fingers, his eyes darting across the printed pages. The top document was a comprehensive digital forensics report compiled by my elite cybersecurity team. It detailed the exact time, the specific internet protocol address, and the unique device identification number he used when he attempted to hack into my corporate servers on Monday afternoon. It showed his incredibly sloppy, amateur attempt to steal my high-net-worth client database. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the attack originated directly from the Buckhead estate. "You tried to rob my company, Jamal." I whispered the truth, cutting through his remaining arrogance like a surgical blade. "You tried to commit corporate espionage so you could sell my private client list to a competitor and save your fake country club wedding. Attached to that forensics report is a fully drafted legal confession prepared by my attorneys. It details your exact hacking attempt, your methodology, and your clear intent to sell my stolen corporate assets." I picked up a heavy gold pen from my purse and placed it deliberately on top of the legal documents. "You have 2 choices right now," I continued, my voice completely devoid of mercy or familial warmth. "You can pick up that pen and sign a full legal confession admitting to your crimes against my company. If you sign it, I will keep this specific file locked in my private vault and handle the breach internally without involving the police. Or you can walk out of this restaurant playing the victim, and I will hand this unredacted file directly to the federal authorities before you even reach the valet stand outside. Corporate espionage and wire fraud carry a combined sentence of 15 years in federal prison. I will happily let you wear an orange jumpsuit to your rehearsal dinner. The choice is entirely yours." Jamal stared at the documents, his chest heaving as the reality of his situation finally crushed him. The illusion of his golden child superiority was completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. He looked at me, realizing for the very first time in his pampered, entitled life that I was not his subordinate. I was not the family mule meant to carry his burdens. I was the executioner, and I was holding the blade directly over his neck. He picked up the gold pen. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the metal barrel. Tears of pure, absolute humiliation spilled over his eyelashes and dripped onto the crisp legal paper. The favorite son, the pride of the Washington family, was crying in the middle of a luxury steakhouse because he had finally been beaten. He signed his name on the dotted line, surrendering all of his power and officially admitting his guilt. He pushed the folder back across the table, looking completely broken and hollow. I picked up the folder, inspecting the signature to ensure it was legible before tucking the confession safely back into my tote bag. "You have until your rehearsal dinner tomorrow night," I said, my voice icy and final. "You and your bankrupt fiancé better figure out how you are going to explain this to her snobby parents, because I officially own your wedding venue, and the doors are permanently locked. Get out of my sight." The evening of the rehearsal dinner arrived with the kind of thick, suffocating humidity that Atlanta is famous for. The event was being held at the most exclusive private country club in the metropolitan area. For decades, this specific club had been an impenetrable fortress of old Southern money. When they finally began admitting affluent African American families, my parents treated their acceptance letter like a royal decree. They had paraded their membership around their megachurch congregation for years, using it as the ultimate proof that the Washington family had firmly secured their place at the very top of the Black elite. They loved hosting events in the grand ballroom beneath the massive crystal chandeliers and the vaulted ceilings trimmed in gold leaf. Tonight the ballroom was packed to absolute capacity. The room was a masterclass in spectacular financial delusion. On one side of the aisle sat the prominent elders from my parents' megachurch, dressed in custom-tailored suits and expensive silk dresses. They were sipping top-shelf champagne and admiring the massive, towering centerpieces of white roses and imported orchids. On the other side of the aisle sat Brittany's family, who had flown down from Greenwich, Connecticut. They were a sea of pale skin, stiff postures, and pastel country club attire. They were looking down their noses at the Atlanta crowd, projecting an aura of quiet, superior wealth. It was the most brilliant, devastating stage play I had ever witnessed. Half the room was entirely bankrupt, and the other half was completely drowning in federal tax liens. They were two destitute, desperate families sitting across from each other, smiling and raising their crystal glasses, completely unaware that the other side did not have a single dollar to their name. Sitting right in the center of this fraudulent masterpiece was my brother, Jamal. The golden child of the Washington family looked like he was about to physically collapse. He was wearing a bespoke tuxedo, but the crisp white collar of his shirt was soaked with nervous sweat. He kept wiping his forehead with a linen napkin, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. He knew the truth. He knew that less than 36 hours ago, he had signed a legally binding confession admitting to federal wire fraud and corporate espionage. He knew that the lavish boutique hotel where he was supposed to get married tomorrow morning was permanently locked because I owned the commercial debt and had canceled the event. He was sitting at the head table drinking heavily, waiting for the invisible timer to run out. Beside him sat Brittany. Her performance was almost admirable in its absolute psychotic denial. She was aggressively playing the role of the blushing, affluent bride. She was laughing loudly, tossing her blonde hair, and clinging to Jamal's arm. She was banking her entire future on the desperate hope that my mother Brenda would somehow magically fix the frozen bank accounts before tomorrow morning. Brittany had looked directly at the foreclosure documents on my phone in the hotel powder room, but her entitlement was so deeply ingrained that she simply refused to believe the gravy train had derailed. She thought if she just kept smiling, the money would reappear. They did not know that I was outside, pulling up to the grand entrance of the country club in a sleek, black, chauffeured vehicle. I did not come to hide in the background. I did not come to slip in quietly and take a seat at a dark table in the back corner, the way my mother had always demanded I do. I came to burn their fake kingdom to the ground. I stepped out of the car, wearing a stunning custom-designed crimson silk gown. The color was bold, aggressive, and completely unapologetic. The heavy silk trailed behind me like a liquid flame against the polished marble steps of the club entrance. I wore a brilliant diamond tennis necklace that caught the ambient light and threw sparks across the evening air. My hair was styled in an elegant sweeping updo, showcasing the sharp, confident lines of my face. Malik walked right beside me, wearing a razor-sharp charcoal tuxedo, his presence a silent, imposing reminder that I was heavily guarded and completely untouchable. We walked past the valet stand, past the heavy oak double doors, and stepped directly into the grand ballroom. The shift in the room was immediate and undeniable. The string quartet playing softly in the corner of the room seemed to fade into the background. The low hum of polite high society chatter began to drop off table by table. Heads turned, glasses paused halfway to people's mouths. The megachurch elders who had spent the last 2 weeks listening to my mother spin vicious lies about my supposed mental breakdown stared at me in absolute shock. Brenda had told the entire congregation that I was a bitter, unstable spinster who had abandoned my family out of pure jealousy. She had painted a picture of a broken, desperate woman losing her grip on reality. But the woman walking down the center aisle of that ballroom did not look broken. I looked like a billionaire. I looked like the chief executive officer of a global empire, radiating a cold, untouchable power that instantly commanded the entire room. The cognitive dissonance hitting the church elders was palpable. They could see with their own 2 eyes that Brenda had been lying. At the head table, Jamal saw me walking toward the center of the room. All the remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. He dropped his fork onto his porcelain plate with a loud clattering sound. Brittany followed his gaze, and when she saw me in that crimson gown, her fake pageant smile instantly shattered. She grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles turning stark white, just as they had in the powder room. But it was Brenda who reacted with pure, unadulterated panic. My mother was standing near the Greenwich side of the room holding a glass of wine and desperately trying to charm Brittany's bankrupt father. When she saw me standing in the center aisle, glowing with health and draped in expensive silk, her survival instincts kicked into overdrive. Her carefully constructed high society facade completely cracked right down the middle. She could not let me speak to the guests. She could not let me shatter the illusion of her perfect family in front of the white elite she was so desperate to impress. Brenda slammed her wineglass down onto a nearby tray and charged across the ballroom floor. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, selfish fury. She marched toward me, waving her arms frantically, trying to intercept me before I could reach the head table. She did not care about the hundreds of eyes watching her. She only cared about maintaining control over the narrative. "Security!" she shrieked, her voice echoing sharply against the vaulted ceilings. "Security! Get over here right now!" She stopped just 2 feet in front of me, her chest heaving as she tried to physically block my path down the aisle. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "Remove this woman!" Brenda commanded, turning her head to shout at the club staff standing near the perimeter. "She is not on the guest list. She is not welcome here. She is having a severe psychiatric episode and she is trying to ruin my son's rehearsal dinner. Get her out of this ballroom immediately, before I call the police." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood perfectly still, letting her manic, desperate screams wash over me. The entire ballroom was dead silent now, watching the matriarch of the Washington family absolutely lose her mind in the middle of a formal event. The church elders were exchanging horrified glances. Brittany's parents were whispering furiously to each other, clearly wondering what kind of chaotic, unstable family their daughter was marrying into. Calvin rushed over from the bar, trying to grab Brenda's arm and pull her back to save face, but she violently yanked her arm away. She was completely laser-focused on humiliating me. "Did you not hear me?" Brenda yelled, gesturing wildly toward the heavy oak doors. "I said remove her! My husband and I are platinum members of this establishment. We are paying for this entire event, and I want this ungrateful, unstable woman thrown out into the street." The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sound of measured, confident footsteps approaching from the main lobby. It was Mr. Sterling, the general manager of the elite country club. He was an older, distinguished gentleman who had managed the property for 20 years, known for his strict adherence to protocol and his absolute discretion. Brenda saw him approaching and immediately let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. "Thank goodness, Mr. Sterling," she gasped, smoothing her dress and attempting to recover her affluent southern charm. "I am so sorry for this terrible disruption. My daughter is deeply unwell and she has crashed our private event. Please have your security team escort her off the premises. She is absolutely not on the list." Mr. Sterling did not even look at my mother. He walked right past her, completely ignoring her frantic demands. He stepped directly in front of me, stopping just a polite distance away. He placed his hands behind his back and offered me a deep, highly respectful bow. "Good evening, Ms. Washington," Mr. Sterling said, his voice carrying a calm, authoritative weight that echoed perfectly through the quiet ballroom. "I apologize for the commotion at the entrance. Your private table has been prepared exactly to your specifications at the front of the room. May I offer you or your guest a glass of champagne before you are seated?" Brenda literally choked on her own breath. She stumbled backward, her mouth dropping wide open in absolute horror. Calvin stared at the general manager as if the man had just started speaking in a foreign language. The entire room collectively held its breath, trying to comprehend why the manager of the most exclusive club in Atlanta was bowing to the woman who had just been called a psychiatric intruder. "What are you doing?" Brenda stammered, her voice trembling with disbelief and rising panic. "Mr. Sterling, what is the meaning of this? I demand that you remove her right now." I slowly turned my head and looked directly into my mother's terrified eyes. A cold, lethal smile spread across my face. I let the silence stretch out, forcing her to feel the crushing weight of the moment. I looked at the woman who had left me to bleed out in a trauma bay. I looked at the woman who had stolen my money to fund her delusions of grandeur. "I own the holding group that bought this club last week. Brenda," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, chilling whisper that carried perfectly to the front row of the church elders. "You do not have platinum status anymore. You do not have the authority to call security. You are standing in my living room." The words hung in the grand ballroom like a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of every single person watching us. Brenda looked as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from her lungs. Her knees actually buckled beneath the layers of her expensive silk dress, and Calvin had to lunge forward to grab her waist just to keep her from collapsing onto the polished hardwood floor. The sheer terror in her eyes was absolutely magnificent. She realized in that exact second that she could not call security to throw me out because the security team worked directly for me. She could not threaten the country club manager to revoke my access because I signed his paychecks. She had brought a lifetime of arrogant entitlement to a battle against a woman who had quietly bought the entire battlefield. Mr. Sterling, the general manager, offered me a gracious professional smile and extended his arm toward the front of the room. "Right this way, Ms. Washington," he said, his voice carrying a calm authority that demanded absolute respect from the waitstaff. Malik offered me his arm and I took it, letting him escort me down the center aisle. We glided past the rows of perfectly decorated tables. I could feel the heat of 100 stares burning into my back. The prominent elders from my parents' megachurch were whispering furiously to each other, completely scandalized by the sudden implosion of Brenda's carefully curated narrative. Brittany's wealthy parents from Greenwich, Connecticut looked entirely confused and deeply unsettled. They were watching the powerful, affluent black family they thought they were marrying into suddenly cower in front of a daughter they had never even heard of. Mr. Sterling led us to a premium reserved table situated perfectly between the head table and the massive elevated stage at the front of the ballroom. A waiter immediately pulled out my chair and handed me a leather-bound menu, while another poured a crisp glass of imported sparkling water. I sat down, smoothing my crimson gown, taking in the spectacular view of my family, completely drowning in their own panic. Jamal was staring at his plate, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Brittany was gripping her water glass so tightly I thought the crystal might shatter in her hands. Calvin managed to drag Brenda back to her seat at the head table, but the atmosphere was completely poisoned. The entire ballroom had descended into a tense, suffocating silence. Nobody was eating. Nobody was drinking. They were all waiting for the other shoe to drop. Calvin, being the desperate, arrogant patriarch that he was, simply could not handle the loss of control. He could not tolerate the whispers echoing from the megachurch elders, and he certainly could not let his future white-in-laws think the Washington family was losing their grip on high society. He needed to spin the narrative. He needed to project power and reassure the elite guests that everything was perfectly fine. I watched him signal to a waiter, asking for a fresh glass of champagne. He stood up from his chair, smoothing his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket, and tapped his crystal glass with a silver fork. The sharp ringing sound cut through the heavy silence of the ballroom. Calvin plastered a wide, booming smile onto his face, masking his absolute terror with years of practiced corporate charm. "Family and friends," Calvin announced, his voice projecting loudly across the room. "Please do not let a brief moment of passionate family business interrupt this beautiful evening. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate love, unity, and the joining of two incredible dynasties." He stepped away from the head table and walked purposefully up the short staircase to the main stage. He stood behind the polished wooden podium, grabbing the microphone. Behind him, two massive projector screens displayed a tasteful, elegant monogram of Jamal and Brittany's initials, surrounded by digital white roses. "The Washington family has always been a pillar of strength in this community," Calvin continued, his voice dripping with fake, charismatic warmth. "We have a legacy of Black excellence that stretches back generations. We know what it means to build wealth, to protect our community, and to overcome temporary obstacles. We are a family that stands together through thick and thin, holding fast to our faith and our proud name. We do not let anything break our foundation." I sat at my table, listening to the man who let me bleed out in an emergency room give a sermon on family unity. The absolute hypocrisy of his words made my blood run cold. He was trying to sweep my existence under the rug, hoping if he spoke loudly enough and used enough buzzwords, the wealthy guests would simply forget the scene at the door. Malik looked across the table at me. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a small digital adapter cable. He set it gently next to my glass of sparkling water, giving me a slow, deliberate nod. It was time. I stood up from my chair. I picked up the adapter cable and my cell phone. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured grace of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The crimson silk of my gown rustled softly as I climbed the short staircase to the stage. Calvin saw me approaching, and his fake smile instantly vanished. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward to block my path. "Chloe," he hissed under his breath so the microphone would not pick it up. "Do not do this. Do not ruin your brother's night. Go sit down before you destroy this family forever." I did not even look at him. Malik had stepped up right behind me, flanked by two massive men from my private corporate security detail. They positioned themselves flawlessly, effectively boxing Calvin away from the podium without causing a physical altercation. Calvin realized instantly that if he tried to grab me, he would be forcefully restrained in front of his entire congregation. He stepped back, his face turning a sickening shade of gray. I took my place behind the polished wooden podium. I adjusted the microphone, pulling it closer to my mouth. I looked out over the sea of wealthy socialites, church elders, and affluent guests. My father loves to speak about the Washington family legacy. I said, my voice smooth, clear, and echoing powerfully through the grand ballroom. He loves to talk about building wealth and overcoming temporary obstacles. But I think it is time we stop speaking in metaphors. Let me show you what they really mean when they talk about their foundation. I plugged the adapter cable directly into the audiovisual input port mounted on the podium, connecting my phone to the massive digital projector system. I tapped my screen, and the giant, elegant monogram of Jamal and Brittany's initials instantly vanished. The screens flashed bright white before displaying a massive, high-resolution image of a legal document. It was the deed to the 6-bedroom Buckhead estate where my parents lived. Right next to the deed was a stark, glaring red banking notice displaying a massive 90-day past due default status. And right below that was the legal transfer of ownership, proving that my corporate holding company had purchased their residential debt in cash. The collective gasp from the audience was audible. The prominent megachurch elders who had praised Calvin's financial stewardship for years stared at the screens in absolute shock. The generational wealth my parents love to boast about does not exist, I announced, my voice carrying a lethal, chilling authority. That massive estate in Buckhead is completely bankrupt, and as of Tuesday morning, I am the legal owner of the property. The luxury cars they drive, the expensive suits they wear, and the very tickets that granted them access to their elite social circles were entirely funded by me. I was their silent, anonymous bank account for 10 years. I tapped my phone screen again, shifting to the next slide. The screens now displayed a detailed financial forensics report, highlighting Jamal's completely drained corporate accounts, followed by the unredacted legal confession he had signed in the steakhouse just 2 days prior. My golden child brother Jamal is not a successful technology entrepreneur. I continued, locking eyes with the Greenwich family sitting frozen in their seats. He is a fraud who blew his investor capital on luxury vacations and expensive jewelry. Just 48 hours ago, he attempted to commit corporate espionage by hacking into my private company servers to steal my high-net-worth client database. The only reason he is sitting at this dinner instead of a federal holding cell is because I forced him to sign that confession to avoid 15 years in prison. Brittany's mother let out a loud, horrified choke, covering her mouth with her hands. Brittany herself was sobbing at the head table, burying her face in her hands. But I was not finished. I tapped my screen one more time. The final slide displayed the heavily leveraged debt portfolio, tax liens, and civil court judgments belonging to Brittany's parents. And for those of you marveling at the joining of two powerful elite dynasties, I added, staring directly at Brittany's father, who was turning a violent shade of purple. You should know that the Greenwich family is drowning in 3 separate mortgages and federal tax debt. These two families are completely destitute. They have spent the last 6 months desperately trying to scam each other into funding a luxury lifestyle that neither of them can actually afford. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. Guests were whispering furiously, pointing at the screens, and shaking their heads in disgust. Calvin was covering his face, trapped on the stage behind my security guards. Brenda was sitting at the head table, completely paralyzed, staring straight ahead with dead, empty eyes. Her entire social standing, her reputation at the church, her carefully crafted illusion of superiority had just been incinerated in front of the exact people she worshipped. But financial fraud is not the true legacy of the Washington family, I said, raising my voice just enough to cut through the rising clamor of the room. The guests slowly quieted down, turning their attention back to the stage, captivated by the sheer magnitude of the destruction. I leaned closer to the microphone, gripping the wooden edges of the podium. They talk about strong family bonds. They talk about standing together through thick and thin. I whispered the pain of my past, finally weaponized into absolute power. Let me show you their heart. Let me show you exactly what it costs to be their daughter. I closed the visual presentation on my phone and opened my secure audio files. I pressed play, holding the device near the direct line input. The high-fidelity surround sound system of the country club amplified the digital recording with crystal-clear perfection. The panicked voice of the trauma surgeon echoed through the silent ballroom. Mrs. Washington, this is Dr. Evans at Atlanta General Hospital. I have your daughter Chloe here. She has suffered a severe internal hemorrhage from a ruptured ectopic pregnancy. We are rushing her into emergency surgery right now. Her condition is critical. You and your husband need to get here immediately. I watched the faces in the crowd contort with horror. The lead pastor of my parents' megachurch dropped his linen napkin onto his plate, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then Brenda's voice echoed through the speakers, loud, annoyed, and dripping with irritation. Doctor, we are at the country club right now. Jamal is playing in the alumni golf tournament finals in 20 minutes. His fiancée Brittany is here, and her parents just flew down to meet us. They are a very prominent white family from Greenwich, and we are hosting them. We cannot just leave and cause a scene. The audio captured Dr. Evans pleading with her, explaining that I had lost a massive amount of blood and was going into hypovolemic shock. He told her I might not survive the night. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for a mother to scream, waiting for a mother to drop everything and run to her dying child. Instead, the final, devastating response from Brenda echoed off the crystal chandeliers, hitting the audience like a physical blow. Look, doctor, tell her we are praying for her. We will come tomorrow if she is still there. I hit the stop button. The recording ended, leaving a suffocating, heavy silence in its wake. The illusion was not just broken, it was completely annihilated. I looked down at Brenda, who was now weeping silently, her face buried in her arms. I looked at Calvin, who could not even lift his head. I had stripped away their wealth, their pride, and their secrets. But the audio recording had stripped away their humanity. They were entirely ruined, and the facade was permanently shattered. Brittany stood at the head table, shaking uncontrollably, as the audio of my mother saying she would not leave a golf tournament faded into the heavy, suffocating silence of the grand ballroom. She looked up at the massive projection screens, still displaying the absolute financial ruin of both our families. The fantasy of her Black Excellence Country Club wedding evaporated in an instant. Her father, a man drowning in tax liens and unpaid wages, marched over to the head table with a face completely drained of color. He grabbed Brittany by the arm, pulling her away from Jamal with aggressive force. "We are leaving right now!" he barked loudly enough for the church elders in the front row to hear. "We are not tying ourselves to a family of destitute frauds and sociopaths." Brittany did not argue. She looked at Jamal, who was sitting frozen in his chair, completely humiliated and stripped of his golden child armor. The man she thought was a millionaire tech entrepreneur was nothing but a broke criminal sitting in a venue he could not afford. She reached for her left hand and violently pulled the 3-carat diamond engagement ring off her finger. She threw it directly at his chest. The heavy diamond bounced off his custom-tailored tuxedo lapel and clattered onto the hardwood floor, rolling away into the dark shadows beneath the table. "You lied to me, Jamal!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the silent room, breaking whatever spell was holding the crowd hostage. "You are absolutely pathetic!" She turned on her heel and stormed down the center aisle, followed closely by her humiliated parents. They pushed past the country club manager and disappeared out the heavy oak double doors, leaving Jamal entirely alone at the head table, staring at the empty space where his entire fake future used to be. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for him. I turned my attention away from my brother and looked down at my parents. Brenda and Calvin were still trapped near the main stage, surrounded by my private security guards. Their high society friends, the megachurch elders, and the local politicians, were already gathering their expensive coats and whispering furiously. They rushed toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Washington family collapse. The social exile was immediate and permanent. I walked gracefully down the steps of the stage, my crimson silk gown gliding smoothly over the polished wood. Malik met me at the bottom of the stairs, holding a thick, heavy manila envelope. He handed it to me with a silent, respectful nod, his eyes shining with profound pride. I approached my parents, stopping just 2 feet away from them. Calvin could not even lift his head to look me in the eye. His booming, arrogant pride had been completely obliterated by the public display of his poverty and cruelty. Brenda was weeping openly now, but there was absolutely no sympathy left in my heart to give her. She reached out a trembling, manicured hand toward me.
Chloe, please,
She sobbed, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her absolute ruin. You made your point. You embarrassed us in front of the entire church, but please do not take the house. We have nowhere else to go. You are our daughter. We are your family. I looked at her perfectly styled hair and the expensive diamond tennis bracelet resting on her wrist. All of it was paid for by the daughter she was perfectly willing to let die in a hospital bed. I held out the manila envelope and pressed it firmly against her chest until her shaking hands instinctively came up to grab it. I died in that hospital room, Brenda, I said, my voice perfectly calm, cold, and devoid of any emotion. You are talking to the woman who inherited my body and my bank accounts. Inside that envelope is a formal, legal eviction notice. You have exactly 30 days to pack up whatever cheap belongings you can fit into your leased cars and vacate my property. If you are still inside that Buckhead estate on the 31st day, I will have the Fulton County Sheriff remove you by force. Calvin finally looked up, tears streaming down his weathered face. He looked like a broken old man. You are really going to leave us with nothing? He asked, his voice a pathetic, raspy whisper. I smiled, a slow, final, chilling smile. I am leaving you with exactly what you gave me when I needed you most. Nothing. I turned my back on them, taking Malik by the arm. We walked out of the grand ballroom together, our heads held high. We left my parents weeping in the center of the elite country club they could no longer afford, surrounded by the completely shattered ruins of their fake empire. The venue staff were already moving in to clear the tables, treating them not like platinum members, but like unwanted trespassers who had overstayed their welcome. 6 months passed since the night of the rehearsal dinner crash. The fallout was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. Atlanta high society is a small, unforgiving circle, and news of their financial fraud and unimaginable cruelty spread through the city like wildfire. The megachurch leadership officially asked Calvin and Brenda to step down from all their prestigious committees, stating that their behavior did not align with the values of the congregation. The prominent elders who had witnessed the audio recording were thoroughly disgusted by my mother's callous disregard for my life. Without my money to shield them, my parents were promptly and legally evicted from the massive estate. They had to move into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a far less desirable neighborhood outside the city limits. Calvin was forced to take a mid-level management job at a logistics company just to keep the lights on. Brenda had to actually start clipping coupons and shopping at discount stores entirely stripped of her country club status and her designer wardrobe. Jamal faced his own devastating reality. Because he signed the corporate espionage confession, I allowed him to avoid federal prison, but the financial ruin was absolute. He was completely blacklisted from the tech industry. He was currently working a minimum wage retail job selling cellular phones just to pay off the massive civil fines the Securities and Exchange Commission had slapped him with after his fake venture capital firm collapsed. His light-skinned privilege and his arrogant charm could not save him from the crushing weight of actual manual labor. The golden child was finally learning what it meant to wake up early and work a miserable shift just to survive. Brittany never spoke to him again, having quickly moved on to find another target to fund her delusions. I was standing in the massive gourmet kitchen of my Buckhead penthouse, looking out over the glittering, spectacular Atlanta skyline. The crisp evening air drifted in through the open balcony doors, carrying the sweet scent of the city. My home was filled with the warm, beautiful sounds of genuine laughter and clinking crystal glasses. I was hosting a private, intimate dinner party to celebrate the most profitable quarter in the entire history of my organic skincare brand. But the people sitting around my massive marble dining table were not blood relatives. They were my chosen family. Malik was sitting at the head of the table, telling a hilarious story to my production managers and my lead cybersecurity engineer, David. Sitting right next to Malik was Dr. Evans, the trauma surgeon who had fought so hard to save my life on that cold operating table 6 months ago. I had made a massive anonymous donation to his hospital wing to fund emergency care for uninsured minority women, but we had maintained a genuine, beautiful friendship ever since. He looked up and smiled at me, raising his glass in a silent, respectful salute. I walked over to the dining table, carrying a cold bottle of expensive vintage champagne. I poured a glass for myself and looked around the room at the brilliant, loyal people who had truly supported me. I did not have a mother who loved me, or a father who protected me. I did not have a brother who celebrated my success or treated me like an equal. But I had built a multi-million-dollar fortress of absolute peace. I had completely erased the toxic people who refused to make space for my life, and in doing so, I created a beautiful, vibrant space for people who actually deserve to be there. I raised my crystal glass to the ceiling, the sparkling wine catching the warm light of the modern chandeliers overhead. "To new beginnings," I said, my voice full of profound, overwhelming joy and absolute freedom. "To new beginnings," Malik echoed, clinking his glass against mine, followed by a chorus of cheers from the rest of the table. I took a slow sip of the sweet champagne, letting the warmth spread deep into my chest. The deep surgical scars on my abdomen had fully healed, fading into faint silver lines that simply reminded me of the brutal battle I had won. I had survived the ultimate familial betrayal and emerged as the undisputed, powerful architect of my own empire. The Washington family name was officially mine now, and I was thriving in the absolute perfect peace of my undeniable victory. True family is defined by mutual respect and support, not just by bloodlines. When toxic relatives use your loyalty as a weapon to mask their own insecurities, the most powerful response is to cut their access to your peace. You never owe your success or financial stability to people who constantly diminish your worth to elevate someone else. Walking away from an abusive environment allows you to build an authentic empire surrounded by those who truly value you. Have you ever had to establish hard boundaries with family members? Share your experience below and subscribe for more empowering stories today.